The first thing Daniel Whitmore noticed was not the old man, not the small diner on the corner of Maple and 3rd, and not even the quiet clatter of silverware echoing through the late evening air. It was the moment the waitress thought no one was looking. Daniel had built a $10 billion logistics empire by noticing small things others ignored. Tiny details. Quiet patterns. The kind that revealed truths people try to hide. That night had been ordinary by most standards. Rain tapped softly against the diner windows while neon lights from the gas station across the street flickered in tired red and blue reflections on the glass. Daniel sat alone in a corner booth, his $2,000 suit jacket draped neatly over the back of the vinyl seat, reviewing numbers on his phone while waiting for his steak sandwich and coffee. The diner was the kind of place most CEOs would never step into. Faded menus. Old country music humming from a jukebox that probably hadn't been replaced since the 90s. The scent of bacon grease and fresh coffee hung permanently in the air. But Daniel liked places like this when traveling between cities. They were honest, predictable, simple, and people tended to forget someone important might be sitting nearby. That was when he saw her. The waitress moved quietly through the diner carrying a tray of plates with steady hands. Her name tag read Emily Carter. Mid-20s, maybe. Blonde hair pulled into a simple ponytail. Calm eyes. The kind of presence that blended into the background unless you paid attention. Daniel had noticed her earlier because she worked differently from the others. No rushed movements. No forced smiles. Just quiet efficiency. But what happened next made him lower his phone completely. At the far end of the diner, an elderly man in a worn army jacket sat counting coins beside his plate of meatloaf. His hands moved slowly, carefully stacking quarters and dimes into a small pile beside the receipt. The man looked to be in his late 70s. A Vietnam veteran, judging by the faded patch stitched onto the sleeve. Emily approached the table, glanced at the coins, and gave the old man a warm smile. Then she said something softly that Daniel couldn't hear. The veteran nodded and thanked her. Emily took the receipt and walked toward the register. But she didn't ring anything up. Instead, she quietly slipped a $20 bill from her own apron pocket and placed it into the register drawer before printing a receipt marked paid. She moved quickly, like someone practiced at not being noticed. Daniel leaned back slightly in his booth, watching carefully now. Emily returned to the veteran's table and placed the receipt down beside his empty coffee cup. The old man looked confused at first, then relieved. He thanked her again, his voice carrying across the quiet diner. Emily simply smiled and told him to have a safe night before walking away. No announcement, no attention, just a small act disappearing into the routine of the evening. Most people in the diner never noticed. But Daniel Whitmore did. Because this was the 3rd time that week he had seen the same waitress secretly paying for a veteran's meal. Daniel Whitmore did not immediately return to his phone. Instead, he watched the door close behind the old veteran as the man stepped slowly out into the misty evening, pulling his worn jacket tighter against the cool air. Inside the diner, the rhythm of the night continued as if nothing unusual had happened. Plates clinked softly. Coffee poured. A truck driver laughed quietly at the counter while the jukebox hummed a familiar country melody. But Daniel remained still in his booth, studying the room with the quiet patience that had once helped him turn a struggling freight company into one of the largest logistics networks in North America. Patterns told stories. And this one felt incomplete. Emily Carter moved between tables again, clearing plates, refilling coffee mugs, offering the same calm smile to every customer. There was nothing dramatic about her behavior. No proud glance toward the veteran who had just left. No hint that she had done anything unusual. In fact, she seemed almost careful not to draw attention to herself at all. Daniel had spent years surrounded by charity galas, foundation dinners, and public announcements where wealthy donors proudly attached their names to every generous act. What he had just seen was the opposite. Quiet, private, invisible. A moment later, the cook rang the service bell, and Emily appeared beside Daniel's booth carrying his sandwich and fresh coffee. She set the plate down with practiced ease. The smell of toasted bread and grilled onions filled the small space between them. "Is there anything else I can get you tonight, sir?" she asked politely. Her voice was calm and steady, the kind of voice that suggested long hours and patience with strangers. Daniel looked up at her for a moment, studying her expression. There was no nervousness, no performance, just quiet professionalism. "No," he said simply. This is perfect. Thank you. She nodded once and moved away before he could say anything more. Daniel watched her cross the diner floor again, his curiosity growing stronger now. A few minutes later, the manager stepped out from the kitchen carrying a clipboard and stopped near the register. He was a heavy-set man in his 50s with tired eyes and a permanent coffee stain on his apron. Daniel finished half of his sandwich before finally standing and walking toward the counter. The manager looked up as Daniel approached. "Everything all right with your meal?" he asked. "It is excellent," Daniel replied. Then he glanced briefly toward the door where the veteran had left. "The waitress who was serving that gentleman earlier. Emily, right?" The manager followed his gaze and nodded. "Yes, sir. Emily Carter." Daniel rested one hand lightly on the counter. "I noticed she covered his bill." The manager sighed softly, the kind of sigh that suggested a story he had told before. "She tries to be discreet about that." Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. "Tries." The man leaned closer across the counter and lowered his voice. "Truth is, she does it more often than you think." Daniel felt a quiet shift of interest settle in his mind. "How often?" The manager glanced around the diner, then shrugged. "Every time a veteran comes in alone." Daniel looked back toward Emily just as she was helping an elderly couple gather their coats near the door. She smiled politely and held the door open for them before returning inside. No applause. No recognition. Just another quiet moment disappearing into the routine of the night. Daniel Whitmore slowly folded his receipt in half, realizing something unusual was unfolding in the small diner on Maple Street. And for the first time in a long while, he found himself genuinely curious about someone wearing an apron instead of a business suit. Daniel Whitmore returned to his booth, but he was no longer thinking about the numbers waiting on his phone. The rain outside had grown steadier now, soft drops tapping against the windows while the neon sign outside flickered in the reflection of passing headlights. Inside the diner, the atmosphere remained calm and familiar, the kind of quiet place where regulars knew the cook by name, and the smell of coffee seemed permanently woven into the walls. Daniel took a slow sip from his mug and watched Emily Carter continue her shift. She moved from table to table with the same steady rhythm, never rushing yet never slowing down. A construction worker asked for more coffee, and she refilled his mug before he even finished the request. A young couple struggled with their toddler near the counter, and she quietly brought a small cup of crackers for the child without charging them. Each action was simple, ordinary even. Yet Daniel noticed something unusual in the way she treated people. She paid attention. Not the polite kind of attention people show when they want a tip, but the quiet kind that came from actually seeing someone. Daniel had spent most of his adult life in boardrooms where every conversation carried an agenda. Investors calculated risk. Executives measured opportunity. Even charity events often came wrapped in reputation and public recognition. But here in a roadside diner on Maple Street, a waitress was giving away her own money to strangers without anyone knowing. That did not fit the patterns Daniel understood. A few minutes later, the front door opened again with a soft chime. A man wearing a faded navy jacket stepped inside, shaking rain from his cap before walking slowly toward the counter. Daniel noticed the patch on the sleeve before anything else. United States Army. The man looked to be in his late 60s, his posture straight, but tired in the way of someone who had worked hard most of his life. Emily noticed him immediately. Her expression changed almost imperceptibly, softening with a quiet warmth that Daniel was beginning to recognize. She greeted the man by name. "Good evening, Mr. Parker. Usual coffee?" The man nodded and smiled. "That would be wonderful tonight." She poured the coffee before he even sat down and placed the mug in front of him along with a slice of warm apple pie. "You have had a long day," she said gently. The man chuckled softly. "You always seem to know that." Daniel watched carefully now, his curiosity sharpening into focus. The pie had not been ordered. The man did not ask about the price, and Emily did not write anything down. She simply returned to her other tables, continuing her work as though nothing unusual had happened. Daniel finished the last bite of his sandwich, but did not ask for the check. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his attention fixed on the quiet exchange unfolding across the diner. 20 minutes later, Mr. Parker finished his coffee and reached into his wallet. Daniel saw the familiar hesitation again, the careful counting of bills. Emily approached the counter just as the man began placing the money down. She glanced at the total, then gently slid the bills back toward him. "Tonight is taken care of," she said quietly. The man looked confused for a moment before understanding crossed his face. Emily, you really should not keep doing this. She only smiled and shook her head softly. You already did your part for all of us. The man left a few dollars for the coffee and stepped back into the ring. Daniel watched the door close behind him. Then he looked toward the register where Emily was standing again. And for the second time that night, he saw her quietly slip money from her own pocket into the drawer. Daniel Whitmore remained seated long after his plate had been cleared. The rain outside the diner continued to fall in a steady rhythm, turning the streetlights along Maple Street into long golden reflections across the wet pavement. Inside, the diner felt warm and quiet, filled with the low hum of conversation and the soft rattle of dishes being stacked behind the counter. But Daniel's attention never drifted far from the register, where Emily Carter stood finishing another order. For years Daniel had trusted one principle above all others in business. If something unusual happens once, it might be coincidence. If it happens twice, it is a pattern. Tonight he had just witnessed it twice. Emily moved away from the register again, delivering a plate of pancakes to a truck driver who had just come in from the rain. She asked about his long route across state lines, listened as he described driving nearly 200 miles that afternoon, and refilled his coffee before he even realized the mug was empty. Daniel noticed how easily people spoke to her. There was something calm about her presence, something steady that made strangers comfortable in ways that expensive restaurants and polished servers rarely managed. A few minutes later she returned to the counter to organize receipts. Daniel stood from his booth and walked slowly toward the register again. The manager was still there, marking numbers on his clipboard. Daniel rested one arm lightly on the counter. That is the second time tonight, he said quietly. The manager did not need clarification. He followed Daniel's glance toward Emily and nodded with a tired smile. I told you she does that. Daniel lowered his voice slightly. How long? The manager closed his clipboard and leaned against the counter. 5 years. Daniel looked at him with surprise. 5 years. Just about, the manager replied. Ever since she started working here. Daniel turned his eyes back toward Emily as she wiped down an empty table near the window. The neon lights outside cast faint reflections across the glass behind her, while passing cars sent brief flashes of white light across the diner floor. She did not look like someone with extra money to give away. Her shoes were worn, her uniform carefully pressed, but clearly used for many long shifts. Daniel had built entire departments in his company dedicated to analyzing financial behavior, and nothing about this situation made logical sense. Does she know you are aware of it? Daniel asked. The manager shook his head slowly. She thinks she is subtle. Daniel considered that for a moment. Why veterans? The manager hesitated before answering. His voice softened slightly when he finally spoke. I asked her once. Daniel waited. The manager glanced toward Emily again to make sure she was busy with another table. She said they already paid their share for this country. Daniel studied Emily again from across the diner. At that moment she was helping an elderly woman zip up her coat while holding the door open for her husband. The couple thanked her warmly before stepping out into the rain together. Emily watched them leave with the same quiet smile before turning back toward the counter. Daniel folded his arms slowly, the thought forming clearly in his mind now. In 5 years of running one of the largest companies in the country, he had met countless people who talked about kindness. But this was the first time he had seen someone practice it every single day without expecting anyone to notice. Daniel Whitmore did not leave the diner. That night, the rain outside continued falling in steady lines across Maple Street, turning the quiet town into a soft blur of reflections and headlights. Inside, the warm yellow lights of the diner created a small island of calm in the middle of the dark evening. Daniel sat back down in his booth with a fresh cup of coffee that Emily had brought without being asked. The steam rose slowly from the mug as he watched her continue moving through the room with the same quiet rhythm that had caught his attention earlier. For most people, the evening would have ended there. A meal finished. A bill paid. Another anonymous stop along a highway between cities. But Daniel Whitmore had built his life around curiosity. Curiosity about systems. About people. About the hidden reasons behind choices others made without explanation. And tonight, that curiosity had settled firmly on the young waitress who quietly paid for strangers without ever mentioning it. A few minutes later the front door opened once more, letting in a brief rush of cool air and rain. The bell above the door chimed softly. An older man stepped inside slowly, carefully closing his umbrella before shaking the rain from its edge. His posture was straight but stiff, the careful movements of someone who had lived many years with discipline. Daniel noticed the familiar detail again. Another worn military jacket. The name stitched across the chest read Harrison. The man walked to a booth near the window and sat down with a quiet sigh. Emily noticed him immediately from across the room. Her expression softened again in the same subtle way Daniel had seen earlier. She walked over with a coffee pot already in her hand. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison," she said warmly as she poured the coffee into his mug. "You look like you could use something warm tonight." The man smiled gratefully. "Long drive back from the hospital today," he replied. "But I cannot complain." Emily nodded gently and placed a bowl of soup in front of him before he could even ask. "This one is on the house," she said quietly. "You should not drive on an empty stomach." Daniel watched the exchange carefully. The man did not question it. Instead, he simply thanked her with a look of quiet understanding that suggested this was not the first time it had happened. Daniel slowly stood from his booth again and walked toward the man's table once Emily had moved away. "Excuse me," Daniel said politely. The veteran looked up. "Yes." Daniel offered a respectful nod. "I hope you do not mind me asking, but do you come here often?" The man smiled faintly and gestured toward the steaming bowl of soup. "Often enough to know this place has the best coffee in town." Daniel glanced briefly toward the counter where Emily was ringing up another order. Then he lowered his voice slightly. "And the most generous waitress." The man chuckled softly, as though the statement contained a truth that many had already discovered. "Emily Carter?" he asked. Daniel nodded. The veteran leaned back in his seat and wrapped both hands around his coffee mug for warmth. For a moment he studied Daniel carefully, as if deciding how much to say. Then he spoke quietly. "Most people think she is just being kind." Daniel waited. The man looked down into the dark surface of his coffee for a long moment before continuing. "But there is a reason she always pays for veterans." Daniel felt his curiosity sharpen instantly. "What reason?" The old man lifted his eyes again, his expression thoughtful and slightly heavy with memory. "Because for Emily Carter, this was never about generosity." He paused before adding softly, "It is about someone she lost." The veteran, named Harrison, sat quietly for a moment after speaking, his hands resting around the warm coffee mug as if the heat helped steady his thoughts. The diner continued its calm rhythm around them, the soft clink of dishes, the murmur of distant conversations, and the steady whisper of rain outside against the windows. Daniel Whitmore waited patiently. In business, he had learned that the most important answers often came after silence, when people decided whether a stranger had earned the truth. Harrison finally lifted his eyes again. "Her father served in the army," he said slowly. "Many years ago." Daniel leaned slightly closer, listening carefully. Harrison glanced toward the counter where Emily Carter was helping a couple pay their bill. She laughed softly at something the woman said before handing them their receipt and wishing them a safe drive home. Nothing about her expression suggested the quiet history the veteran was about to reveal. Harrison continued speaking. His name was Michael Carter. The name meant nothing to Daniel, but the weight in Harrison's voice made it clear it carried meaning here. "He was stationed overseas for a long time," the old man said. "From everything I heard, he was the kind of soldier people trusted, the kind that looked after everyone else before thinking about himself." Daniel nodded slowly. Harrison took another sip of coffee before continuing. "Emily was still very young when he passed away." Daniel felt the quiet gravity in the man's words. The veteran did not speak dramatically. He simply stated the truth with the calm tone of someone who respected memory. "She grew up hearing stories about the people her father served beside," Harrison said. "Men who came home carrying the weight of years most civilians never understand." Daniel glanced across the diner again. Emily was wiping down a booth near the window, her movements calm and routine. It was difficult to imagine the quiet waitress carrying a history tied to military service and loss. Harrison followed Daniel's gaze. "Her mother raised her alone after that," he continued. "Money was never easy. From what I understand, Emily started working as soon as she could. School during the day, jobs at night." Daniel folded his hands slowly on the table, absorbing the pieces of the story as they came together. Harrison leaned forward slightly. But the part that stayed with her was the respect her mother always had for the men who served beside Michael Carter. Daniel raised his eyes. Harrison nodded once. Every year on the anniversary of his passing, Emily and her mother would visit the Veterans Center across town. They would bring homemade food, sit with the older soldiers, listen to their stories. Daniel imagined the scene quietly forming in his mind. A young girl sitting beside aging veterans, hearing stories about courage, sacrifice, and loyalty long before she understood the full meaning behind them. Harrison smiled faintly. Over time, those men became part of her life. Some of them were the last people who could still remember her father. The rain outside softened slightly, the sound fading into a gentle background rhythm against the diner windows. Harrison rested his mug back on the table. After her mother passed away a few years ago, he said, Emily kept the tradition alive on her own. Daniel felt a quiet realization beginning to form. So paying for the meals, he said slowly. Harrison nodded before. Daniel finished the sentence. It is her way of saying thank you. The old veteran looked toward the counter again, where Emily Carter was carefully organizing receipts for the next group of customers. Not just to them, Harrison said quietly, but to the man she never stopped being proud of. Daniel Whitmore remained seated across from Mr. Harrison long after the veteran finished speaking. The story lingered in the quiet air between them like the fading warmth from the coffee cups resting on the table. Outside the diner, the rain had softened to a light drizzle, the kind that left the streets shining under the yellow glow of streetlights. Inside, the small restaurant continued its gentle rhythm of late evening customers finishing meals and preparing to head home. Daniel glanced across the room again at Emily Carter. She was helping the cook carry a small tray of freshly baked pies toward the counter, her movements calm and steady as always. Nothing about her posture suggested that she carried a story filled with quiet loss and long memories. She simply looked like a hard-working waitress finishing another shift. Daniel turned back toward Mr. Harrison. Does she know you all talk about her like this? He asked quietly. The veteran smiled faintly and shook his head. Emily does not do it for recognition. He lifted his coffee mug again, warming his hands around it, as if the gesture helped him gather his thoughts. Most of the men who come through here eventually notice what she is doing, but none of us say much about it. Daniel raised an eyebrow slightly. Why not? Mr. Harrison looked toward the counter where Emily was carefully cutting a slice of pie for a young delivery driver who had just come in from the rain. Because she would probably stop if it became a big conversation, the old man replied. Daniel considered that answer carefully. In the world he knew, kindness often arrived with publicity and recognition. Charitable foundations issued press releases. Wealthy donors stood on stages while photographers captured the moment. But here was someone doing the opposite. Quiet generosity repeated night after night with no announcement and no expectation of praise. Mr. Harrison continued after a moment. There is another part of the story that most people do not hear. Daniel leaned forward slightly again. What part? The veteran lowered his voice just enough that it blended with the quiet sounds of the diner. Michael Carter did not just serve with honor. According to the men who knew him, he saved several lives during his time overseas. Daniel listened closely. Harrison nodded slowly. One of those men still comes to this diner once or twice a month. Daniel followed the veteran's gaze across the room again. Emily was standing near the door now, holding it open for a young couple carrying grocery bags. She wished them a safe evening before returning to the counter. Does she know? Daniel asked. Harrison shook his head again. No, the man never told her. Daniel felt a quiet curiosity sharpen inside him once more. Why not? The veteran's expression softened. Because the man believes the debt runs the other way. Daniel frowned slightly. What do you mean? Harrison gave a small, thoughtful smile. He believes Michael Carter already paid the greatest price a soldier can give. The rest of us have simply been trying to honor that memory ever since. Daniel sat back slowly in his chair, letting the words settle in his mind. Across the diner, Emily Carter continued moving from table to table with the same quiet patience she had shown all evening. Most people in the room saw nothing unusual, just a waitress doing her job. But Daniel Whitmore now understood something very different. Every small meal she paid for was not just kindness. It was a promise quietly kept for a father she never stopped honoring. Daniel Whitmore sat quietly for a long moment after Mr. Harrison finished speaking. The diner felt calmer now as the late evening crowd slowly faded away. A few booths remained occupied by travelers finishing their meals, but the earlier noise had softened into the comfortable quiet that settles over small diners near closing time. Outside, the rain had nearly stopped. Only an occasional drop slid down the glass windows while distant headlights passed along Maple Street. Daniel glanced toward the counter again, where Emily Carter was stacking clean coffee mugs beside the register. She worked with the same steady patience she had shown all evening, completely unaware of the story that had just unfolded at the table behind her. Mr. Harrison finished the last sip of his coffee and gently set the mug down. "You seem like a man who notices things," he said thoughtfully. Daniel gave a small nod. "It is part of my job." The veteran studied him for a moment before asking, "What do you do, exactly?" Daniel hesitated briefly. In boardrooms and conferences his name usually carried immediate recognition, but here inside the small diner it felt unnecessary. "I run a logistics company," he answered simply. Mr. Harrison nodded with polite interest, but did not press further. Daniel looked back toward Emily again. She was wiping the counter now, while quietly speaking with the cook about closing inventory. Her voice carried a calm confidence that made the simple task feel almost comforting. "Does she ever talk about her father?" Daniel asked. Mr. Harrison shook his head slowly. "Not often." He paused before adding gently, "She does not need to." Daniel understood what the man meant. Some memories lived in actions rather than words. Paying for meals. Offering quiet respect. Listening to the stories of aging veterans who carried decades of experience few others asked about. Across the diner, Emily finished organizing the register and began collecting the last few receipts from empty tables. The manager switched off one of the overhead lights, leaving only the warmer lamps above the booths glowing softly across the room. Mr. Harrison pushed his chair back and stood carefully. "I should head home before the roads get too slick tonight," he said. Daniel stood as well and offered a respectful handshake. "Thank you for sharing that story with me." The veteran smiled warmly. Some stories deserve to be heard. He placed a few dollars on the table for his coffee and slowly made his way toward the door. Emily noticed him leaving and walked over quickly. "Drive safely tonight, Mr. Harrison," she said kindly as she opened the door for him. "I will," the old man replied before stepping out into the cool evening air. Daniel watched the door close once more. For a few seconds the diner felt almost completely silent. Emily turned back toward the room and noticed Daniel still standing beside the table. "Did you need anything else before we close?" she asked politely. Daniel looked at her for a moment, studying the quiet confidence in her expression. Then he smiled faintly and shook his head. "No," he replied, "but I believe I finally understand something." Emily tilted her head slightly, curious. Daniel glanced around the small diner one more time before speaking. "This place may look like an ordinary diner," he said calmly. "But tonight I realized it is actually one of the most honorable rooms I've walked into in a very long time." Emily looked slightly surprised by the comment, though she simply smiled politely in response. She did not realize that Daniel Whitmore had already made a decision about what would happen next. The diner was nearly empty now. Only the quiet glow of the overhead lamps remained, casting warm light across the polished counter and the last few booths waiting to be cleaned before closing. Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Maple Street glistened under the streetlights, and the distant sound of a passing car faded slowly into the night. Emily Carter moved calmly through the diner collecting the final plates from the empty tables. She stacked them carefully on her tray and carried them toward the kitchen, humming softly to herself the way people do at the end of a long shift. It had been another ordinary night, at least as far as she knew. Daniel Whitmore stood near the door, putting on his coat while watching the quiet scene unfold. For most of his life, he had believed that impact came from large decisions, major investments, strategic moves that changed entire industries. But tonight he had witnessed something very different. One person quietly honoring a promise that no one else even knew existed. He walked slowly back toward the counter where Emily was finishing the register for the night. She looked up when she heard his footsteps. "Your receipt is already taken care of," she said politely. "But if you need anything before we close, just let me know." Daniel placed his credit card gently on the counter. "Actually, I would like to pay for something else." Emily glanced at the card and then back at him, slightly confused. "Your meal has already been paid for." Daniel nodded. "I know." He looked around the diner one more time before continuing. "I would like to cover every veteran's meal here for the next year." Emily blinked in surprise. clearly unsure she had heard him correctly. For the next year? Daniel nodded calmly. Every single one. The manager, who had just stepped out of the kitchen with a stack of clean plates, froze mid-step when he heard the conversation. Emily looked from Daniel to the manager and back again. That is very generous, she said carefully. But you do not have to do that. Daniel smiled slightly. You are right. He slid the card across the counter anyway. I do not have to. The manager approached slowly, still trying to understand what he was hearing. Sir, that could be thousands of dollars. Daniel shrugged lightly. Then it sounds like money well spent. Emily studied his expression for a moment, realizing he was completely serious. Why would you do something like that? She asked quietly. Daniel glanced toward the door where the veterans had walked out earlier that night. Then he looked back at her. Because someone reminded me tonight that respect does not need an audience. The diner fell silent for a moment. Even the cook paused in the kitchen doorway to listen. Emily looked down at the card resting on the counter, then back at Daniel with a small, thoughtful smile. My father used to say something similar, she said softly. Daniel nodded once. Then he sounds like someone worth listening to. The manager finally picked up the card with slightly shaking hands. Emily watched quietly as he prepared the receipt. Outside, the streetlights continued to glow across the wet pavement. Inside the small diner on Maple Street, something simple but powerful had just changed. And for the first time since he walked through the door that evening, Daniel Whitmore understood a truth that no boardroom had ever taught him. Sometimes the greatest influence a person can have does not begin with power or money. Sometimes it begins with noticing the quiet kindness of someone who never expected to be seen.